It was the mid-1970s, a time when Bob Marley's name was beginning to travel far beyond Jamaica. His music was crossing oceans, entering places it had never been invited before. Concert halls, radio studios, editorial rooms filled with men who believed culture had rules, borders, and hierarchies. On this particular evening, Bob Marley sat calmly in a formal interview setting. The lights were bright, the air heavy with expectation. He wore no costume of rebellion, no defiance. Just his familiar presence, grounded and still. Around him were journalists, critics, cultural commentators. People who believed their words carried authority. One of them did. He leaned forward, confident, almost rehearsed. His voice was measured, sharp, and dismissive. He spoke about music standards, about sophistication, about what he believed belonged on the world's greatest stages. Then he said it. He called Bob Marley's music uncivilized. The word hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Uncivilized. It wasn't just a critique of sound. It wasn't about rhythm or melody. It was a judgment of origin, of people, of history, of worth. In that single word lived centuries of condescension dressed up as criticism. For a moment, no one moved. Cameras stayed fixed on Bob Marley's face, waiting for the reaction they thought would come. Anger, defense, a sharp comeback. That was what moments like these usually produced. That was what television thrived on. But Bob Marley did nothing. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. He did not smile. He simply sat there, listening. His eyes lowered briefly, not in submission, but in thought, as if the words had reached somewhere deeper than the room itself. Those who knew him understood this silence was not weakness. It was restraint, because Bob Marley had heard words like this before. He had heard them as a child growing up poor in Jamaica. He had heard them whispered about his skin, his hair, his background. He had heard them from record executives who told him his sound was too raw, too foreign, too real. He had heard them from people who believed culture only counted when it looked like theirs. The critic shifted in his chair, perhaps uncomfortable now. The silence was no longer dramatic. It was heavy. It forced everyone in the room to sit with what had just been said. Bob Marley slowly lifted his head. His face showed no rage, no humiliation, only a quiet sadness mixed with something else, clarity. He looked around the room, not at the critic alone, but at the system that had given that word permission to exist. The cameras leaned in closer. Producers held their breath. Viewers at home felt it too. Something was coming, but not the kind of response they were used to. Bob Marley opened his mouth slightly, then stopped. He closed his eyes for just a second. In that pause, the meaning of the moment began to change, because when Bob Marley finally chose to speak, it would not be to defend his music. It would be to expose something far deeper. Bob Marley opened his eyes again, and when he did, the room seemed smaller. Not because it had changed, but because everyone inside it had suddenly become aware of themselves, their posture, their assumptions, their comfort. The critic who had spoken leaned back slightly, as if realizing too late that his words had traveled further than intended. This was no longer a casual exchange. It was something else now. Bob did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, the kind of breath taken by someone who understands the weight of history behind a single word. His hands rested loosely in his lap. No clenched fists, no nervous movement, just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes from knowing who you are long before anyone tries to define you. He looked at the critic again, gently this time, without accusation. And then he looked past him, toward the cameras, toward the unseen audience. Beyond the studio walls, millions of people, many of whom had been called the same thing in different ways, primitive, backward, less than. Words that had followed them through schools, borders, offices, and stages. Bob Marley knew this moment was not only about him. The interviewer shifted in his seat, sensing the tension climbing. This was not going according to plan. There was supposed to be debate, maybe a sharp quote, something loud and entertaining. Instead, there was silence. And silence has a way of making people uncomfortable, especially those who are used to controlling the narrative. Someone off camera coughed. Another. Producer glanced at the clock. Time was passing, but Bob Marley was not rushing. He had spent his life learning that some things lose their power when you refuse to meet them on their terms. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. Not rehearsed, not defensive. It carried the tone of someone explaining something. Simple, almost obvious, yet rarely understood. He did not raise his volume. He did not change his expression. He spoke as if he were speaking to one person, not an entire room waiting to judge him. He talked about where music comes from. Not charts or studios, but places, streets, homes, pain, joy. He spoke about people who sing because they must, not because they are invited to. About drums made from whatever could be found. About songs born in struggle, carried by memory instead of paper. The critic listened now, no longer interrupting. Bob Marley's words did not attack. They revealed. He spoke of how music grows from the soil it comes from, how it reflects the lives of those who create it. He did not ask for approval. He did not ask to be understood. He simply stated what was true to him. Around the room, something began to shift. The word uncivilized no longer sounded confident. It sounded small, limited. It began to expose the narrowness of the perspective that had used it. The cameras caught subtle changes in faces. A journalist lowering his eyes. Another, nodding slowly. Someone realizing, perhaps for the first time, that sophistication is not measured by distance from pain, but by honesty within it. Bob Marley paused again. Mid-thought. Not because he had run out of words, but because he was choosing which ones mattered. And in that pause, it became clear that whatever he said next would travel far beyond this room, beyond this interview, beyond this night. Bob Marley's pause lingered longer than anyone expected. It was not an empty silence. It was filled with memory, with roads walked barefoot, with nights when music was the only shelter. The room waited, but Bob was not waiting for permission. He was listening inward, choosing care over speed. When he spoke again, his voice carried something deeper now. Not explanation, but reflection. He spoke of childhood not as a biography, but as a feeling. Of growing up in a place the world rarely tried to understand. Of hearing songs before he ever understood words. Of rhythm existing before language. He spoke about how music arrived in his life not as art, but as survival. A way to stay whole when the world kept breaking people apart. The critic shifted again. His earlier confidence had thinned. This was no longer a debate about taste or genre. It had become a quiet reckoning. Bob described how music carries the fingerprints of those who create it. How suffering leaves a sound. How joy leaves another. He spoke of people who were never taught theory, never taught permission, yet still found a way to sing. Not because they wanted applause, but because silence was heavier than noise. Because when you are ignored long enough, you learn to speak. Through vibration instead of words. The camera stayed close on Bob's face. His eyes were calm, but there was weight there. Not anger. Not sadness alone. Something older. Something patient. He spoke about the word uncivilized without repeating it. He did not need to. Everyone knew what hung between them. He talked instead about who gets to decide what is refined, who gets to draw lines around culture and label what belongs inside. He spoke of how power often mistakes itself for wisdom, how comfort often confuses itself with truth. Around him, the studio felt different. Even the lights seemed harsher now, exposing more than intended. A producer stopped taking notes. A journalist leaned forward without realizing it. This was not the kind of moment that could be summarized in a headline. It was unfolding too slowly. For that, too honestly. Bob Marley's hands moved slightly as he spoke, not dramatic, just human. He spoke of music as a mirror, how it shows people who they are, even when they don't like the reflection. How some reject what they see not because it lacks value, but because it challenges what they believe about themselves. The critic's expression had changed completely. The word he had used earlier now sat between them like an object neither wanted to touch. It had lost its sharpness. It had become exposed. Bob's voice softened near the end of his thought. He spoke about dignity, not as something given by institutions or critics, but as something carried quietly, passed down, protected. He spoke about people who have been told their voices do not matter, yet keep singing anyway. Not to be heard by the powerful, but to remind themselves that they exist. Another pause followed. This one felt closer to a breaking point, not because of confrontation, but because something irreversible had already happened. The room understood. Whatever was supposed to happen next, could no longer happen the same way, and somewhere beyond the studio walls, beyond the cameras and the broadcast schedule, a larger audience was leaning in without knowing why, sensing that they were about to witness something that would not fade when the lights went off. Bob Marley remained still. The silence had stretched longer than anyone expected, and now it carried weight. Not the awkward kind, the heavy kind. The kind that forces people to hear their own thoughts. The critic finally broke eye contact. For the first time that night, he looked unsure of himself. Not angry, not defensive. Just exposed. Bob Marley lifted his head slowly. When he spoke, there was no sharpness in his voice. No attempt to win. Only clarity. He said that music does not come from comfort, it comes from truth. And truth is often born in places the powerful never visit. He spoke of people who sing not because they are celebrated, but because they are ignored. People whose lives are reduced to stereotypes long before their voices are ever heard. He said that if civilization means forgetting where you came from, then he had no interest in it. If civilization means silencing pain to make others comfortable, then it was not something he wished to belong to. He said music was never meant to impress critics. It was meant to reach people who needed to feel less alone. The room did not move. No applause, no interruption. Just listening. Bob Marley looked at the critic again, gently, almost kindly. He said that calling something uncivilized often says more about fear than about culture. That fear of what we do not understand is easier than the work of understanding it. And that music, real music, has never asked permission to exist. The critic swallowed. His notes lay untouched on the table. The authority he had entered the room with had quietly disappeared. When the segment ended, there was no dramatic sign-off, no closing argument. But something had shifted. The next morning, newspapers did not focus on the insult. They focused on the response. Headlines spoke of dignity, of restraint, of a man who refused to be pulled into bitterness. Radio stations replayed the clip, not because of controversy, but because people felt something they couldn't explain. Letters arrived at the network, from immigrants, from artists, from people who had been called lesser in different ways. They didn't thank the critic. They thanked Bob Marley. Years later, that moment would still be remembered. Not as an argument, but as a lesson that strength does not always raise its voice, that respect does not need to be demanded, and that sometimes the most powerful answer is not anger, but truth spoken calmly. Bob Marley left the studio that night. the same way he entered it, quiet, grounded, unbroken. But the room he left behind was never the same. Asterisk. The critic never spoke about that night again. In later interviews, when asked about Bob Marley, he avoided the question, not out of anger, out of something closer to humility. But Bob Marley carried that moment with him, not as a victory, as confirmation that the world was still divided between those who listened and those who judged, between those who defined civilization by power and those who defined it by humanity. Years later, Bob would tell a close friend that night stayed with him longer than most applause ever did, because applause fades, but silence reveals truth. He said the most dangerous thing a person can do is reduce another culture to a word, primitive, uncivilized, less, because once you strip people of dignity, you no longer have to hear them. Bob Marley refused to let that happen, not by shouting, not by attacking, but by standing still and speaking carefully, by showing that grace can disarm arrogance faster than rage ever could. That single exchange became a reference point, taught in universities, quoted by musicians who had never set foot in Jamaica, shared among people who had been told their voices did not belong. And slowly, something changed. Reggae was no longer introduced as a curiosity. It was introduced as a language born from survival, memory, and resistance. Bob Marley never called himself a teacher. But that night, he taught the world something simple and uncomfortable, that civilization is not measured by accents or institutions. It is measured by how we treat voices that do not sound like our own. When Bob Marley died years later, that clip resurfaced again, not because of the insult, but because of the response. People did not remember the critic's words. They remembered Bob's calm, his restraint, his humanity. And that is why his music outlived the moment, outlived the labels, outlived the critics, because true civilization does not fear unfamiliar rhythms. It listens, and Bob Marley made the world listen.